Hey kids, this is Ivan again. How you doing? This is the 7th installment in the weapons series, where I'm going to keep on trying to answer some of the questions I posed in the first segment of this whole series. So I'm going to try to tackle the last 3 of the 12 groups of questions that I had in terms of what to do about weapons. So these would actually address some of the odder optional rules that were in like first and second edition AD&D. So these would be like, what about the size of the weapon? Should that affect the speed of the weapon? Should it affect, how many attacks you get? Where should it go in initiative? All that sort of thing. The speed factor question, if you will. How do you handle weapons versus armor class? Weapons versus different types of armor and different types of monsters in terms of the thickness of their skin and all that sort of stuff. And what should you do about the natural attacks of monsters? Should they kind of mimic those various piercing, slashing, bludgeoning weapons, all that sort of thing? So we're really going to talk about speed factor and weapons versus armor class. So first off, Hackmaster Basic has a really interesting mechanic. I'm not suggesting you use it. I'm not going to use it. But it's a really interesting idea. Every weapon and every spell has a number attached to it. And I guess they use like a clicker or something, and maybe it goes by seconds or whatever. But say your weapon or spell has a value of 5. You do whatever you're going to do. And then, the guy keeps clicking or counting off, segments of the round or whatever you might call it. And then, 5 later, so when it gets to number 6, you get to go again. And if you, had something that was a value of 8, you'd have to wait, 8 more times. So when the guy said 9, then you get to go again. It's an interesting mechanic and an interesting way to handle the whole speed factor, quandary. An alternate thing, sometimes I mess around with using speed factor and sometimes I don't. But rather than using the really cumbersome rules and the number for everything, I like the idea of just having fast weapons, normal weapons and slow weapons. And then maybe some weapons might be ultra fast and ultra slow. And about the easiest thing you can do in terms of using that mechanically in your game is just having an effect where you go in initiative. So if you're doing something like D10 initiative like I am, if you have something like a dagger and you decide that's an ultra fast weapon, maybe you get to add 2 to your initiative. Maybe if you have a short sword, maybe that's somewhat fast and you get to add 1 to your initiative. Something like a long sword or a battle axe would be nothing, no modifier. And then something like maybe a two-handed sword might subtract 1 or 2 from your initiative. So in terms of speed factor, that's about as complicated as I'd ever want to get. In terms of weapons versus armor class, there's been a lot of better system than the really wonky AD&D, first and second edition weapons versus armor class tables. I think Swords and Wizardry might have had a good one. There's been a lot of great ideas bandied about the web. But the idea that you might let bludgeoning and piercing and slashing weapons have +1 or +2 at the most, or -1 or -2 to different kinds of armor, it seems to be like a usable system if you want to go with some kind of weapons versus armor class. Because anything more than that just gets too troublesome. You figure that bludgeoning weapons are probably going to be better against rigid and semi-rigid armors, so versus plate or versus all the chainmail, the banded mail, the splint mail, and they might give a +1 to hit against those things because you're still able to hit the guy, and because it's this big heavy mace or something like that, he still might take some damage. If it's something like a club or like a quarterstaff, then it might give no modifier. It might give a negative modifier to the hit roll because it's a quarterstaff and it's just not going to do all that much damage to a guy that's in a serious suit of plate mail. A lot of the semi-rigid and rigid armors, they'll give you much better in terms of your defense against slashing weapons or edged weapons. So maybe swords actually have a -1 to hit some of those things like banded mail or chain mail or plate mail or something like that. And piercing weapons would probably have an advantage over certain mails like chain mail or ring mail or maybe studded leather because there's all these spaces in between those little links and stuff. And in the case of something like ring mail or studded leather, then there's just leather armor there, and so these things can actually go in and pierce. So maybe they get a +1 to hit, something like that. You just figure out a system that's going to work for you. And also something like, even though plate mail might do really well against slashing and piercing weapons, some really big ones like big pole axes and halberds, they might offer no modifier whatsoever. It might even give a + to hit some kind of armor like that because they're just so big and they have so much mass behind them that maybe all armors just suffer a negative, or in terms of somebody getting a +1 to hit you because they can still hit you. You still can't move around that much, and these weapons are so gigantic, they're still going to damage you. So you can figure out a system like that that makes it, somewhat workable. Maybe something like padded armor is just really terrible against everything, and even though it's technically the same armor class as leather, maybe against like slashing or piercing weapons, you actually get a plus to hit, that type of armor. So just a simple thing, if you want to go with weapons versus armor class, that to me is a lot more workable. And you can just figure out like what kind of armor makes sense to you to have a plus or negative modifier in terms of a bludgeoning weapon, a piercing weapon, or a slashing weapon. If it makes sense to you, just go ahead and do it. For the most part, it just adds too much cumbersome stuff to the game. I understand it makes a lot of sense realistically, and maybe it's like one opponent versus the other opponent. It's like this two-guy battle. It's okay, but when there's a party of 6 people and then like 20 guys on the other side, I don't want to be figuring out all that stuff all the time. But if you want to, you can use a simple system like that. There's also an interesting idea in terms of like how you handle that versus monsters. If some monster has a real thick hide or something like that, then maybe you want to decide that bludgeoning weapons get a normal to hit, but something like a piercing weapon or a slashing weapon is going to suffer a penalty. Maybe something like a wooden thing is going to break against the tough hide of this monster. Maybe also if the monster has like some really nasty claws or talons, maybe those are counted as piercing weapons. And if you've got some guy in chainmail or ringmail or studded leather, maybe it gets a plus to hit those kind of armors because it's just going to pierce right through that stuff. Whereas if you got something a little more substantial like banded mail or plate mail, then it's not going to count so much. And ditto for things like a giant wielding this huge club, maybe he just gets a +1 to hit all the various kinds of armors that offer more protection because he's still just going to whack the heck out of you. And something like that. So those are just some simple things you can do with like speed factors and weapons versus armor class. I don't think you need to get much more advanced or difficult than that if you want to use it at all.